This is off air. Oh, there we go. Well, hello and welcome. This is our jazz anthropology panel. This was kind of an extension of the Jazz in the Hills event that was held back on April 30th in celebration of International Jazz Day, which is a big UNESCO event. Our kind of or local Orlando version of that event was hosted by the Greater Orlando Cares Mentoring Movement. We were going to do this panel as part of the proceedings for that day and decided it'd be a little bit better. We'd have a little bit of a broader reach if we put something online. So basically what we're going to be doing is kind of looking at jazz from a couple different scholarly perspectives, looking at it kind of in relationship with African American history and culture, also with kind of relationships between jazz and the musical and cultural traditions of the broader African diaspora. We've got a few very distinguished panelists here. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Sonny Whitmer, who is adjunct professor of musicology at Rollins College. We're also going to hear from Julian Chambliss, who is the associate professor and department chair of history, as well as the coordinator of the Africa and African American Studies program at Rollins College. And then I'm Eric Bendler. I'm an adjunct professor of anthropology at Rollins College. So we're going to start off with Dr. Whitmer. So I'll pass on the mic to you.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to start with talking about the role of Cuban music in jazz. And it really started with the rhythm. Now, a couple of things to sort of keep in mind at first. Cuban music really started from European melodies and harmonies and the use of African rhythms. And really it was these rhythms that were so powerful in moving into jazz. It really was one of the most important contributions to the creation of contemporary jazz in the United States. For musicians, I'll just throw up here the son rhythm, one of the most important rhythms. And I have some examples I could probably play later, but in the interest of time, I'm going to talk about another important rhythm, which was the habanera rhythm. Many of you will sort of recognize it as something that sounds like a tango, but it is what they call habanera, which means from Havana. And just briefly, it's what they call a tresillo, which is 3 notes, bum, 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 like that. And so let me give you a little bit of history about that. In the 19th century, there were musical influences coming out of the Caribbean, primarily out of Cuba. These urban genres, one of them the contradanza or the habanera, that was the first to gain some international popularity. That Afro-Cuban tresillo rhythm that I just showed you was brought to New Orleans from Cuba, and that was that basis of the danzón, the mambo, the cha-cha-cha. That rhythm was what first came into the United States and started to influence early jazz musicians. One of the most important jazz musicians to start using what he called the Spanish tinge was Jelly Roll Morton. And in 1938, there was a Library of Congress recording where Jelly Roll Morton told Alan Lomax, he says, quote, "Now in one of my earliest tunes, New Orleans Blues, you can notice the Spanish tinge. In fact, if you can't manage to put tinges of Spanish in your tunes, you will never be able to get the right seasoning, I call it, for jazz." So from the very beginning, we see Afro-Caribbean influences in rhythmic structures in jazz. And the song that he was talking about, I'll play for you in a second, but let me play the rhythm that you're going to hear. This is the habanera. I picked a simple example just so that you can concentrate on the rhythm. There's okay, so that's the rhythm. This is the song that Jelly Roll Morton then put into New Orleans Blues. Now this is Jelly Roll Morton and New Orleans Blues. He also used that rhythm in the crave. Okay, so you can get a good idea of how influential this rhythm was in establishing rhythmic devices within jazz. And as everyone knows, it's not jazz unless it's got that swing. And this is pretty much what they're talking about when they talk about that rhythmic swing. We even see examples of the Afro-Cuban son. Now that is a different rhythm, but I will clap it for you so you can hear it when it comes. But this is the Cuban son in Louis Armstrong's New Orleans Stomp. Okay, and there's lots more examples. Ellington uses Latin rhythms in Perdido. That's the Cuban son. Okay. Now, one of the most important things to understand is that the influence of Latin rhythms into the early jazz continues today, and it also has migrated back and forth in a transnational context between Latin America and primarily the Caribbean and the United States. Beginning in about the late 1930s, early 1940s, these kinds of rhythms were discovered by Dizzy Gillespie, who then began collaborating with Mongo Santa Maria and Chano Pozo. Those were both Cubans. Mongo Santa Maria and Chano Pozo were both congueros. They played the congas. They had been brought up to New York by Mario Bauza and Machito, Frank Machito Grillo, who were two of the most important Latin jazz performers in the United States at that time. So you can see where there's the circuity of the rhythms coming in and influencing jazz early, and then later on in the 1930s and 1940s. Now, interesting, where most of this music was being played was obviously in large urban areas such as New York, primarily in Harlem and in Spanish Harlem. So there's a strong connection between the African American community and Latin jazz in terms of the kinds of rhythms that went into those communities and how that was incorporated both into early jazz and later into the big band styles, the Latin jazz styles in the United States, primarily New York. So here is an example of Machito and his Afro-Cubans. So it's pretty easy to hear, obviously, it's pretty easy to hear the Latin influence in those kinds of performances. But here is a performance by Stan Kenton, the jazz master Stan Kenton, called The Peanut Vendor, which is a very important, very almost iconic Cuban popular folkloric song. Okay, so you get the idea. Now, of course, and here is Tjader. Lots of examples. Okay, so strong, that bump, 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 bump. Doesn't sound like Oye Como Va from Santana, right? Yeah, that's Tito Puentes wrote that, believe it or not. Now, the exciting thing about the gift of Afro-Cuban and Afro-Caribbean rhythms to jazz is that then it came back to Cuba in really this, again, this transnational context of influence traveling between both the United States and the Caribbean. Cuba did not have a strong jazz tradition until the middle of the 20th century when this kind of music was being played in New York. Now, of course, then they come back from New York, they come back to Cuba, and they bring this music, and so in the middle of the 20th century, Cuba starts a jazz tradition. One of the most important jazz ensembles is Iraquere. And you can find them performing now all over the world, really a huge international phenomena. Most jazz musicians from Cuba, it's a huge industry, it's a huge tradition, and it would not have happened had we not had those early influences of coming from the Caribbean into New Orleans, primarily New Orleans, having African Americans translate that into those jazz rhythms, those Cuban rhythms into jazz, and then moving it up to New York, and then having New York come back to Cuba. So here's a little bit of Iraquere. I'm going to go in a little bit because this is actually a call, an invocation to have the spirits bless the performance. Okay, so in this sort of quick summary of how Afro-Cuban rhythms and Afro-Caribbean rhythms moved into jazz, then up to New York, and then back down to Cuba, we can see now that Cuba has a very strong jazz tradition as well. And so I think the important thing to understand is how much musical influences, of course we can talk a lot about the social context of all of that, but how much musical influences really do travel between the United States and the Caribbean, and how much of jazz we owe to the Caribbean and the musicians from primarily from Cuba, and then back again. The Cubans, thankful to us, have created their own jazz.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I think we have a couple of minutes where we can sort of reflect on what Sonny said. I'm really interested in this idea of migration of ideas from Cuba to New York and then back again. And it strikes me that that actually sort of reflects some of the modern musical trends that we see, especially in the late 70s and 80s with the emergence of hip hop, where there's a lot of Latin American infusion into that.
Absolutely.
We don't necessarily talk about enough, but I think it's one of the things that, and especially in recent histories, they've talked about a great deal, how important the cooperation and fusion between African American and Puerto Ricans and other Latin American immigrants to New York were into creating what we understand to be hip hop and a lot of the street culture of that time period. So it seems that that cauldron is New York and that it's a gateway to a lot of different people is really important.
Oh, absolutely. It really actually started. We started seeing lots of Caribbean influence in music, even in the 18th century, the end of the 18th century, at the the Haitian Revolution, when the Haitian elite left Haiti, they moved into the eastern part of Cuba, bringing their musical traditions, their expressive culture. They also then moved up into Havana, and that kind of musical migration then ended up in New Orleans. So we see it pretty early now. It didn't really manifest into jazz until a little bit later in the 19th century, but that kind of exchange has been going on for a couple of centuries now. And yes, it's really important to understand that certainly the rhythms coming out of Jamaica and there's a strong tradition within these communities of not only in jazz but now in exchange of words. We see that, of course, now in rap, but there's a long history of that. You have, in Brazil, you have embolados. You have in Cuba, you have the same kind of thing where two people will come together and they will recite, they will speak with some musical background. It's rap. It's a rap battle is basically what it is. So rap battles have been happening in the Caribbean since the Europeans got there. So it's a very European-derived yet African-influenced performance practice. So we see it in the Caribbean first, and then of course, and certainly in Jamaica, that's really where we started to see it transfer into hip-hop, rap and hip-hop in the large urban areas in the Northeast in the United States. Yes, about the 1970s. Late 1960s if you really want to dig deep, but 1970s and certainly by the 1980s it was a full-on phenomena. Now, of course, very much like what we see happen in jazz, it has then migrated to every corner of the world, and certainly in Latin America, we have the huge influence of what we call reggaeton, which is rap with a reggae beat, which of course, Eric can speak to reggaeton as well. But we have been doing this, the United States and the Caribbean, we've been doing this for a long time. And again, I'm just giving you a really brief rundown of sort of the music and the rhythms, identifying some of the rhythms, but with that comes an entire cultural context, an entire social way of thinking. So it's not just the music that goes back and forth, it's the ideas, it's the habits, it's the language, the lingo that they develop. That's been happening for a long time, and it's interesting to see how it continues to, it went from jazz and then into rap, hip-hop, and what's the next thing, It's something else is going to come, so... But we can see historically, we can see the trajectory.
Yeah.
Helps us understand.
Well, I think in our next session, I'll talk about Harlem and its role as a space of sort of cultural enrichment, but also some of the conflicts that grow out of that. which follows up a lot on what Sonny's just talked about. So check in for our next session, and you'll learn more about Harlem and see a unique artifact from that period. Not music, but visually interesting. So come back and check out Jazz in Society 2.